My name's Father Daniel Strickland, and I've been a priest for about 8 years with a community called the Missionaries of God's Love, who some of you would be aware of and some of you wouldn't be aware of. We started 30 years ago in Canberra, and now we've got missions in Canberra, Melbourne, Indonesia, the Philippines, and we're looking to start in India next year, and Darwin as well. So I think we've got about 25 priests, and we've got 6 more being ordained this year. And I'm the head of our seminary here in Melbourne. We have our main seminary here. So I just took over that role this year, and it's all fairly crushing in terms of workload at the moment. If I look a bit, it's because I'm feeling a bit with all the work. But it's great. We've got about 20 guys there, so it's really beautiful work. I wanted to share with you today on the topic of let your light shine. And I hope that this will kind of integrate something of the training that I have in psychology and counselling and in spirituality and my own commitment to adoration and prayer, to kind of bring those two things together. So I want to just begin by sharing with you a story. About 15 years ago, I did some training in pastoral work in Canberra, and this was a course that was run by a Christian organisation that operates around the world. And it was about a year-long course, and there were people who came from right around the world to participate in this. And there was one particular woman in this training course who really struck me. She had a big impact on me. She wasn't a very extroverted person, and she wasn't someone who really grabbed your attention, but there was just something about her presence. And over the training period time with the program, we got to know each other's stories, and I got to know this lady, and she was a German woman who was living and working in Hong Kong. So she had the most bizarre accent. It was like she kind of go from this to this, like it was like this combination of kind of Chinese German. I don't know. It was really okay. This is really weird, but try and work with it right now. So she was living in Hong Kong, and she volunteered as a single person for her Baptist church in Germany about 15 years ago to go and work in an orphanage in Hong Kong for children who'd been abandoned under the one-child policy. And so what she was really doing there was that she was fulfilling the role of being a mother to the little babies. And she would tell me how the littlest children there, they would just kind of like cling onto her legs and they wouldn't let go. And so she'd be walking around like little babies hanging off her legs because they were just so desperate for love and for affection. And anyway, we went for lunch one particular day with this group of people from the training program. This lady came and we were discussing faith and that kind of thing. And she just said to me, Jesus is my best friend, there's no doubt about it. Now, if anyone else had said that to me, I'd be like, okay, don't talk to that person anymore because flaky Christian, you know what I mean? When people say things like that, you think, okay, what are you talking about? And I may not have been the deepest Christian person in the world at that point in my life either. And I would kind of experience myself glazing over. But when she said that, it seemed like the most natural, authentic thing in the world to say. And it absolutely was the truth of her life. There was nothing plastic, there was nothing artificial. She wasn't trying to be holy or pious, that we try to do that sometimes. She wasn't being sentimental, she wasn't being artificial. In a real sense, that was how I experienced her presence, that Jesus was her best friend. And she really, I can say this, that she had become light. And she really radiated the fruit of love to those around her over the course of that year. It was so obvious in her person. And I think that really is because part of the sharing, this is a counselling course we were doing, was that she had allowed the Spirit of Jesus over many, many years to bring about an interior wholeness within her that enabled her to naturally love in the way that he loves. We often force it and we think we have to, we've got to do the right thing because I'm a Christian. This is just a natural integrated process for her. It just radiated. Jesus says to us in the Gospel of Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before the sight of all. Which I think very much ties in with the theme of your summer school of the interior life of the Legionaries, and indeed the interior life of all Christians, that It is our life of interior transformation that, if that's authentic, if it's truly human, if it's incorporating all the aspects of our personality and our personhood, then that should naturally flow into the witness that we bear to others in our day-to-day encounters of the difference that Jesus has made in our lives and the difference that he continues to make in our lives. We shouldn't be like everybody else. We should be radiating the difference that Jesus has made in our lives. And Lucy sent me the section of your handbook about the interior life, and I love the section in that where it talks about our lady being the model for our holiness, because in her we find the perfection of love. And I really like that, because it's not the perfection of the moral life, it's not the perfection of her behaviours, it's the perfection of love that is found in her, that she was the one who loved fully. When I was 18, I returned to the practice of the faith through the messages of Our Lady of Medjugorje. My dad gave me a pamphlet one day, and I was kind of looking for meaning in my life, as you do at that kind of age. And one of the things that stays with me, and which speaks of the fact that authentic human holiness, that authentic human transformation is so attractive, is that when the children of Medjugorje at one particular point, they asked Our Lady, "Why are you so beautiful?" Because it was like this kind of otherworldly experience of beauty. And she said to them, "I'm beautiful because I love." I just think that is absolutely magnificent. I'm beautiful because I love. And somehow her actual physical presence radiated her capacity for loving, that interior reality. So I want to share with you today about letting your light shine, and about the freedom that God desires to bring about within us, so that this can happen naturally in our lives, in a way like my German friend so naturally radiated that reality, in a way that's so attractive, and in a way that set her apart from everyone in that course was a Christian, but that set her apart from everybody else, because she had become light for others. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, about 2 years ago I finished a Masters in Counselling. And I chose to do that at a secular university because I didn't, sometimes as a priest you get in these Catholic bubbles, like everybody you talk to is Catholic and everyone you know is Catholic and all your friends are Catholic, and you're kind of like, okay, so how am I outreaching here? You know what I mean? How am I actually connecting with non-Christians? So I thought, I'm going to do this at a secular university. I did it at La Trobe University, and I can say that the first day was terrifying because, priests haven't got the best rap in the whole world at the moment, and so everyone talk about what you do. I'm going to talk about being a priest with all of these people who don't believe in Jesus. So it was great, It was very confronting, but it was very good for me. It really pushed my boundaries and made me develop in ways that I wouldn't have otherwise. So it finished up a couple of years ago, and by that time I'd really developed some good, close friendships with most of the people actually, but with some particular people. And it's become very easy and very positive to talk about my priesthood, my faith, spirituality, the church in classroom contexts. I didn't really even have to apologise for it, and people were asking me to speak into situations. You kind of become the God person in a situation. I was the God person. So on the final day of the course, we were just having a casual kind of celebration. And I was having a conversation with two of my classmates. So we're all mature age students, obviously. And one of them was kind of from this left-leaning communist background, and the other one was from this kind of, she was a Buddhist, but she'd had a genuine spiritual experience. It was this weird kind of mix. She was Jewish but Buddhist, and so it was a bit like the Chinese-German woman. I couldn't quite work it out, but she'd had a genuine kind of spiritual experience, and she was moving on a path. None of them had ever had any connection with a Christian church, ever. And in this conversation, they were asking me about Pope Francis, because I think it was the time of the Synod on the Family or something in Rome, and so there was a whole lot of stuff in the papers. And they were talking about their own journeys in searching for meaning and looking for faith in their lives. And so we got talking about the scandals in the church over the recent years, and my friend Jamie, who was kind of the left-leaning political guy, he said something that I felt was really important. He said to me, You know, those of us who aren't connected to the church actually want the church to be holy. And he used that word holy. Isn't that beautiful? We want it to be a source of goodness, and that's why it's such a scandal when things do go wrong, because the hopes that we have for the church are real. I think that's fantastic. Whenever you read a newspaper article ripping the church to shreds, I always remember that comment. It's because the church should be living up to higher standards than the rest of society. We're not walking the same path as secular society. And so let's get ripped to shreds, okay, until we get this right. Let's, heal and work through it and process it. I just thought that was a beautiful thing for him to identify, and it just plugs into something that I'm more and more convicted about. That as with my German friend that I mentioned earlier, the light of God is attractive. Isn't that a beautiful picture? I just kind of think that you're drawn to the light. It breaks into that dark situation and it attracts you to its beauty. And if the light is allowed to shine in our lives, it's going to attract people. We don't have to be bashing people over the head with our religion. The light will do the work if it's flowing within us. It will draw people to the deeper places of their hearts. It'll draw people to the places where the echo of the goodness and the beauty and the love and the life that's planted within us by the Creator is still found. And it's often buried under many complex layers in people's lives that we put in place because we've been hurt or we've been rejected or we've been crushed or we've been discouraged or whatever other reason. We lose touch with ourselves and our value and the worth that we have in the sight of our Heavenly Father. And we often use the word brokenness to describe our experience as human beings, and it's not a casual word that has no meaning to it. Because as human beings, every single person on the planet is broken, and the more broken that you are, they talk about the fact that, one of the things we did in our course was a lot of work on shame. And they talk about the fact that the people who can't admit that they've got shame in their lives are generally the people who struggle with it the most. So generally the people who can't admit that they've got brokenness are normally the most broken people in my experience. I had a conversation with someone after a conference who came up to me and said, I don't need to go to a counsellor. And I'm like, I've been with you for 5 minutes and I can tell you need to go. It was just so obvious that she had major issues in her life, relational issues. So we're broken. That's the collective human experience. In some way or another, we're broken up into parts. And we spend much of our lives just trying to manage those parts and hold them together in some sort of way. And in that managing, we often end up struggling with anxiety, or we become depressed, or we get defensive, or we get judgmental, or we suppress parts of ourselves that we prefer weren't there, or we fail to process hurtful experiences in our lives because we don't want to look at them. But in the end, all of these unprocessed experiences, all of these broken parts, all of these unintegrated parts of ourselves, I like that word integration, because it talks about the fact that parts come back together rather than disintegration, where parts are kind of forced apart. In all of these kind of disintegrated parts of ourselves, if we don't process them, if we don't face them, they just end up coming out in our relationships with others. That's what happens, absolutely. And they hurt other people, and they hurt us. They hurt our marriages, they hurt our priesthoods, they hurt our communities, they hurt our prayer groups, and they hurt our families. I'm more and more convinced that the work of God's Spirit is to bring all those broken interior pieces back together, so that instead of spending so much of our interior energy trying to subconsciously or consciously manage all of these broken parts, as they're brought back together and as they're integrated into wholeness, all of that energy that we've been using to manage them gets released in new ways that enable us to love. I can absolutely testify that in my own life. I've had brokenness all over the place. And as I've worked on this over many years, I find that I'm naturally able to love now in a way that I simply could not in the past. I just couldn't do it. And it just happens naturally now. It's the deep inner place in that interior world that we carry within us of reconnecting with those parts, those broken parts. And in that process, reconnecting with the person that God created us to be. And it's the work of God's Spirit that frees that process up and enables us to love. You know, as human beings, we're basically oriented towards two things. The first thing is we're oriented towards growth. So God desires us to grow. That's a fundamental truth. Spiritually, our faith confirms it. Psychologically, sociologically, we're designed to grow. We're not designed to stagnate. And the more I've come to understand what Jesus meant when he called God Father, Abba, the more I'm convicted of this truth. And anyone who has children will automatically get this. You want your children to grow. You want your children to flourish. You want them to be who they're created to be, to realize their potential. And along with this orientation towards growth, there's a deep survival instinct that at the most basic, this is kind of the primeval level of human beings, at the basic level of human beings, we have planted deep within us by our Heavenly Father a survival instinct to keep us alive. If you read the stories of people in concentration camps, that's where you kind of get in touch with it. It's the survival instinct. That was where it was kind of activated within them. And in our own lives, the most obvious place it gets activated is in the fight or flight response. So you know that response where you're in a situation of danger or perceived danger, and your body automatically adjusts and your brain automatically adapts in that situation to either get you out of it, so to fly, or to prepare you to fight, okay? So that's a basic example of the survival mechanism that God's given us. So God desires us to grow. But unfortunately, because of our woundedness as human beings, this growth that I've talked about earlier is often not fully realized, because we end up investing so much energy just trying to survive at an emotional and a spiritual level. I think that's a great image, actually, the heart floating in a life raft. You're like, I know that was my heart for years. It was just trying to survive emotionally and spiritually. I mean, I had a great exterior appearance. I was like head boy of my school, straight A's and all that kind of thing. And then I'd go home at night and cry, you know, in my room. That's where all the disintegration would come out, even though it looked wonderful on the outside. We're often trying to survive at an emotional and spiritual level. We're grappling with the wounds that we often carry within us because of the experiences that we've had and the distorted things that we've learnt about what it means to be acceptable or accepted or connected with others. And we don't necessarily reflect upon these things. In fact, we often don't reflect upon these things, but these are all driving our behavior. Whether we're aware of it or not, they're all driving our behavior. So this man is one of my favorite writers on this particular dynamic, and his name is Dr. Paul Tournier. He was a medical doctor from Switzerland who, from the middle of, I guess he practiced in the middle of the 1900s. He was a very deeply spiritual Christian man. What he noticed in his medical practice over time is that patients would come in with some sort of physical ailment, but what inevitably ended up happening was that as the patients worked out that he was a very attentive man, that he really listened to them, that he didn't kind of have like the 20-minute, you know, you've got 20 minutes for your appointment, sorry, you've got to get out of here. Because he listened to them, they would inevitably end up pouring out their angst, you know, what was really going on in their lives, what was really happening in their families, what was really happening in their interior life. They talk about their struggles, they talk about their challenges, they talk about their difficulties. So in the end, what was happening is that patients were making appointments not because they were sick, but because they wanted to talk to him about what was happening. So he eventually shifted into counselling and psychology and he kind of integrated his Christian faith with his practice of psychology. But one of the things that he commented on in both his medical practice and in his counselling was his observation about how emotionally and personally immature most Christians were that he encountered in his work. How emotionally and personally immature most Christians that he encountered in his work were. So these were people who had real faith. It wasn't people running around in some sort of, faith crisis about, is Jesus alive? Is Jesus alive? I don't know. They believed in Jesus. They were convicted about that fact. They were practicing their faith. They had no questions about their belief in God, but often responded in situations and relationships in ways that were immature, that were defensive, that were reactive, and that certainly weren't of the light, if we want to put it in that way. They would often have whole areas in their lives that they were just pushing to the side and ignoring. And this is normally about anger and sexuality. Those seem to be the two areas. They just push to the side and they ignore because those parts of their lives didn't fit in with what they'd been taught to understand it meant to be a Christian. Those experiences that they were taught that they should be ashamed about. And so those parts had to be pushed to the side, had to be repressed, had to be shut down. And so these people, who were all genuinely seeking to follow Jesus, they were good people, were in fact enslaved to these broken parts of themselves that they were not willing to face. They were not willing to be attentive to them, and they were not willing to listen to them. And so they were enslaved to them, despite all of their good intentions. So one of the fathers of modern counselling and psychology is this man. His name is Dr. Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers really revolutionised the whole approach to psychology by developing what is now called the person-centred approach. So what he found in his work with clients and patients over many years was that as human beings, we learn at a very early age what we have to do or what we have to be in order to be considered worthwhile, in order to be considered worthy of connection with other people. We learn it from our parents, we learn it from our families, primarily when we're very little, but we also learn it from our surrounding culture. And that's why this shifts from culture to culture, because the values are different. In other words, we learn about what he came to call conditions of worth. That if we act according to these conditions, we'll be connected to others, but if we don't act according to these conditions, then we can expect to be rejected and considered of no value, of no worth. In other words, we do what we feel we need to do in order to survive, emotionally, spiritually, and in the other dimensions of our lives. And unfortunately, what can happen with Christianity, and I think this is true in my experience of working with people over the last 8 years and my own journey, is that instead of bringing about what Christianity was intended to bring about by God, a genuine interior transformation and freedom to love through the work of God's Spirit, what often happens is that it becomes for people another framework for just bringing meaning to their lives, So really, it's not much different to Islam, Buddhism, whatever else it is. It's just a framework. And, as long as it, people talk about, well, if it works for you, if it works for you, if it works, that kind of thing you'd experience with people. So it's just a framework. It brings meaning to our lives. And what ends up happening is it just provides us with another series of conditions of worth about what we have to do in order to be acceptable, connected, or worthwhile. So the most common thing is that if I behave in a certain way, then I'm acceptable to God. If I unquestioningly accept everything that I'm told to believe by Father Daniel, then I'm acceptable to God. And in this process, and there's endless ways that this can play itself out, what tends to happen is what I talked about before. People end up pushing, and they just do this subconsciously. They push to the side or they ignore or repress those parts that they have come to believe don't fit within this framework, okay? Again, it's often anger, sexuality, anything that as little children we'd be taught, doesn't fit within this framework. Hurts from the past, things that we might have done that fills us with shame. I'm a real believer in the white picket syndrome, the whole thing where, because I hear a lot of confessions, and I make confession pretty regularly, so I know my own crap, I've got a lot of it, that people can have very nice white picket fence lives, and there can be a whole lot of stuff going on inside, which is just like, oh, okay, that really is not quite white picket stuff. You know what I'm talking about? Like, that there's a whole lot of stuff going on within them that often gets pushed down into the area of shame because we don't feel that we can look at it because of this whole thing of, conditions of worth. Parts of ourselves where we feel angry or violent, malicious, whatever it might be. But the problem is that in ignoring these parts, as we well know, they don't go away. In fact, they tend to push even harder for our attention. That's just what happens. Because they're forcing us to give them the proper attention that they need. They're forcing us to bring them into the light so that they can be restored, so that they can be healed and reintegrated back into the journey that God has with us to wholeness, so that his light can be revealed within us instead of being constantly undermined by these broken parts. But it's this whole thing, if we don't face these parts, if we don't process them, they will completely undermine our faith. And I'm really convicted of the truth of it, actually. So all God, I think, in the end is really asking us to do in all of this dynamic is to open up to a living relationship with him through his Son every day, through deepening prayer. And in that process, the Spirit does the work. This is a dynamic where we open up to God so that we can allow the Spirit to bring those things up. Do you get the difference? It's opening up to vulnerability with God. So that he can gradually bring to our awareness all of those broken parts through the safety of his unconditional love. And as they're gradually brought back together, the transformation that occurs means that God's light becomes our light, and it becomes the light that's radiated to those that we come in contact with. So, just a little bit of a summary before I go on. So what I've been talking about here, which is true, I think, for all Christians, is the spiritual journey is a process of true interior transformation and reintegration of our broken parts into wholeness, where we're given true freedom within and the freedom to genuinely love without having our broken parts undermining that reality, without having them distort that reality. And I think it's important to be aware of this because, as with any genuine, long-lasting process of transformation, this is not a magic trick. It doesn't happen overnight. It won't happen in one retreat. It takes years, as I'm sure you're all aware of, because you've all been on the process for probably longer than me, to be honest. So what I want to break open now with you is something, I guess I want to give us a little bit of a roadmap for this transformation. And just to map something of this journey, which is really about a journey of vulnerability. It's a journey of vulnerability. It's a journey of moving into the light with our broken parts and of gradually becoming light. Because the more I go on, I guess, I've been on this journey in a committed way for 20 years now. And the more that I go into this journey with my Heavenly Father, the more I've been led by him to people who can create safe spaces for this to happen. I think this is just what God does. He leads us into safe spaces for this process to happen. So good spiritual directors, good psychotherapists. I'm a big believer in psychotherapy. I just have to say that publicly to everybody. If you need psychotherapy, go and get it. Get a good therapist. I had a great one, and she was so helpful. Unconditionally accepting friends, there's nothing like a good friend. Absolutely nothing like it. And a Christian community. I mean, you've got one, I guess, here with the reality of the Legionaries, the Legion of Mary. But you might need to find, I don't know how often you guys meet, but might need to find other communities that can support you more closely. I know I have my brotherhood community, and then I have different layers of community that I relate to. So the more that I've seen the Lord do this in my own life, the more excited I get about it, about seeing these stages unfold, and really just so grateful to God for the work that He's done to bring the broken pieces back together in my heart. There's still a lot of broken pieces, but, there's been a whole massive work of healing that's gone on in my own life through the good support that I've received. And I see this also in other people that are intentionally embarking on this journey and doing the hard work, because it's hard work. It doesn't just happen, like that Pantene ad. Remember that Pantene ad from years ago? I don't know if you remember. I feel like I'm showing my age here, but anyway, this is, beautiful, whatever she was, model, and she was always saying it won't happen overnight, but it will happen. It's a bit like, that mad? Yeah, it's a bit like this, you've got to do the work. There's no Pantene shampoo that's going to do it for you. Now, obviously, there's different variations for people on this map, because God doesn't treat us like clones. So what I'm going to say here will connect, hopefully, generally, with your journey. But as I look at the pattern of people that I work with, as I look at my own life, the experience that I see is that there are basically 4 consistent stages. And these aren't necessarily linear, so people might move back and forth between the stages, but they basically follow this process. I hope that you can see yourself in these stages. I hope that you can bring your own wisdom and reflection to them. If you're a seasoned traveller, I hope that it fills you with gratitude for what the Lord's done in your life. If you're on the journey for the first 5 or 10 years, I hope that you can see, okay, this is the pattern. If I'm in the middle of a whole lot of crap at the moment, I know what's going on, because the worst thing about that place is it can seem very dark, and you just need a bit of a map sometimes of this stuff. So let's have a look at this. I love this photo. I just think it's beautiful. The first journey in this transformation is the preparatory stage for transformation. I just think that's a beautiful image of the way that the Father in heaven relates to us. He kind of holds us, and, a baby is not conscious of the care that the Father is giving it, but the baby would die without that care. So this is very much the preparatory stage, where we may not be spiritually aware of what the Father is doing, but He's doing a hell of a lot, He's right there nourishing us spiritually in ways that we may not be in touch with for decades. So people often talk about having a conversion experience in which some way there's a personal encounter with God, and so life becomes divided into what you might call pre-conversion. So in some way, even if I was religious, I was nonetheless, I guess, blind to God in some way. And then post-conversion, where in a real sense there's a definite kind of experience of light, and our eyes are open to God in a new way. And it can be true that we do experience it like this. Like I know for myself, when I was 18, I had this experience with the messages of Medjugorje, and I know that this is what happened. I had a conversion experience. I went from conversion experience, oh my goodness, my life's a mess, to post-conversion. So there was a definite kind of thing there. And there was a whole new awareness of God, and I had to change my moral behaviour and all that kind of stuff. But while there's a truth to this kind of black and white pre-conversion, post-conversion kind of thing, I'm really convicted now that that understanding is really to sell God as Father really short, because He doesn't break into our lives as though He's been wandering around somewhere on Jupiter for the last 18 years. Our Father is always at work with us. From the moment we can see it, and probably, I guess, before, in some sort of spiritual sense, I don't know how these things work, we'll work it out when we get to heaven, but from the moment we're conceived, He's at work within us. He's breathing into us. He's breathing His Spirit. He's forming us. He's sustaining our lives. He's weaving in and through the circumstances of our lives, and they can be incredibly painful sometimes. And He's doing all of that to prepare our hearts for the time when we're ready to genuinely encounter Him, when we're ready to be opened up to Him in a new way, and to freely receive that light. And it very much reminds me of the role of John the Baptist. I think this is very much a John the Baptist stage in our journeys, So John the Baptist, who was a cousin of Jesus, came to prepare the way of the Lord. And this is the John the Baptist stage. I think everybody has this kind of experience of being prepared to receive the light of God's love. I just met up with someone yesterday who's been a Catholic for practicing, committedly for 40, 50 years. And 2 weeks ago, he had the first experience in his life of Jesus' love. This is what I'm talking about. It's like he's been practicing his faith for that long. It's been meaningful, it's been great and all the rest of that. But he didn't actually know Jesus' love in his life, the fact that he was unconditionally loved. And so God did 40 years of John the Baptist's preparatory work to get him to the stage where now he's ready for that next movement on. And this kind of preparatory stage is such a beautiful and such a mysterious thing, I think, because it often is carried deep within our hearts. And for some people, there can be a whole interior experience going on the outside that may, on the outside it may not be visible at all. And we may not be consciously in touch with because of our lack of reflection. One of the blessings of being a priest, I guess, is that you get, obviously, people coming to confide in you things that they may not necessarily tell anybody else. And it's certainly been my experience that people who you would think wouldn't have a spiritual bone in their entire body, there's stuff going on, There's the Father's at work. He's doing stuff within them. Again, in my Masters of Counselling course, as people became more comfortable with me and realised I wasn't going to, bash them with the Bible or, force them to convert to Catholicism or whatever, as they got more comfortable, I found that just about every single person shared about some experience of, some spiritual experience or some experience of God. They couldn't necessarily articulate what was going on because they didn't have the language or the framework, but they'd all, almost without exception, had some experience of God. So the Father's at work. We don't have to get stressed, he's quite capable of saving his children. I used to go to this whole stress, oh my goodness, I've got to convert people, but the Father's at work. We can be confident that he wants to save us more than we want to be saved because he loves us. He's compassionate and tender towards us. I think this is a really beautiful thing to reflect upon in our own lives. Before I had that experience at 18, I know that from the age of 16, there was a stirring in my life to be more aware of God's presence. It just started happening. I just started thinking about God more. I just started being aware that certain behaviours were not good behaviours, that certain ways of relating to people were not good ways of relating. And that just started happening. And it was just like a spiritual reorientation. It just little by little happened over those 2 years, even though I wouldn't have said that I had any real living relationship with God at that point. So this is the preparatory stage, and I'd like to really encourage you. I think a beautiful way to get in touch with this is to just spend some time in silence, in adoration, whatever you want to do, just to reflect on how this stage has been revealed in my own life. The interior stirrings of God's Spirit that maybe we only know about. Or maybe those John the Baptist figures in our own lives. I remember there was one priest when I was at a really low point in my life, when I was 24 and 25 and, contemplating suicide and really, on antidepressants and absolutely collapsed psychologically. And he just stayed with me. I can remember him sitting in my room and just staying with me in that really bad place. So he was a John the Baptist figure who kept, held the light of the Lord out for me at that particular point when I needed it. People who really loved us and who prepared the way of the Lord for us. So the second stage, I think, in this journey is when we choose to take our faith seriously. So I guess that probably is everybody here. But I just want to kind of go through this stage because this, broadly speaking, follows the preparatory stage, and it's absolutely essential if we're going to enter into the freedom that God desires for us. So this is more than just being raised in a Catholic family, okay? It's way more than that. It's more than having a nice experience of God. So maybe I go to a prayer meeting and I have a nice warm feeling. So it's more than that. It's more than going to a nice conference like this today. It's very nice. It's more than that. It's more than going to Mass because that's what we've always done, or because we might go to hell if we don't go to Mass on Sunday. So it's more than that. It's more than, getting married in a Catholic church because my nonna will be angry at me if I don't do it. I don't know how many weddings happen like that. Oh, nonna said I got to do this. Come on, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. So it's more than this kind of cultural experience. This is where I make the decision as a person who has agency to say, I believe in Jesus. I believe that Jesus is real. I've experienced this. I believe this. And I want this to be who I am. I want Jesus to be at the center of my life. We're not so good at this as Catholics, I've noticed. I was watching a Billy Graham thing recently, and, the kind of, praise your Lord stuff drives me a bit crazy sometimes, but he's got a point. He basically believes that people need to make a decision to surrender to Jesus. And tell you what, so do I. I think it's really important to surrender to Jesus and to make that decision in the midst of all of my brokenness, all my unsureness, all of my, I don't know what's going to happen in the future kind of stuff, that he is going to be the center and that I'm going to live my life in reference to him. So while the light of God's Spirit is always at work within us, there comes a point where we have to make a decisive choice to surrender to the light. Now, I know that people sometimes say to me, but Father, I've always had faith. That's just something, I've always been open to Jesus. And others have said, well, Father, God just acted sovereignly in my life, and I didn't really have a choice. I had to surrender. And I understand that, and, God can do whatever he wants in the end. I'm not here to tell God what he can and can't do. But I'm really convicted, basically from my observation, that also in those situations, we still have to come to a point where we allow things to go deeper, where we allow things to be engaged intentionally. Because otherwise, what happens is that things don't mature. They just kind of remain superficial for our whole lives, They never really actually go to that stage where we become the light. We never really step into the light. And I guess if we have a conversion experience, that's more obvious. We have a conversion. I had a conversion through Medjugorje, and I was like, oh my goodness, I have to surrender to the Lord, like I'm a sinner, that kind of stuff. But, in that place, God is so real that if we don't surrender to it, it's kind of like we're denying ourselves. The experience is vital. If we don't experience God as alive and active, well, what are we doing? If we don't believe that he's moving in the world, well, let's go home. He's either the Savior or he's not. But I really believe that there still has to be a choice, because I've known so many people who've had experiences of God who have then drifted away. They've just drifted. They've had some sort of, wonderful experience. I knew a guy when I was back in my novitiate in Canberra. This bloke came to us, and he'd been all over just total disaster of a life, and he was into it. Had a conversion experience. He was praying the rosary 3 times a day. He was doing the whole thing. Well, a year later, he was back living with his girlfriend, and it was, all back on again, and see you later, Catholic Church. You know what I mean? Didn't go anywhere, because he didn't make a decision beyond the experience to surrender. And so God bless him. I don't know what he's doing now, and maybe he's come back, but I never heard of him again. Every person in some way chooses to make the decision or chooses not to make the decision. And if you choose not to make the decision, you've made a choice in that sense. And the problem with this kind of stuff is that if you don't make a decision, eventually what happens is that a child in your life dies, or you get cancer, or there's a major car accident, or there's a sex scandal in the church. Anyone heard of those? Or father did something that, made me really hurt and angry. And so because I haven't made a decision to surrender to the faith, I leave the church. You know what I mean? Because those experiences, if we haven't surrendered, it can't hold those experiences. It just can't hold them. They're too painful. They're too difficult. when we make this decision, I think it leads to concrete differences in our lives. And I guess there's a couple of really concrete things which I guess you're already doing. The first thing is we have to invest in prayer, and there's something that the Legion of Mary just brings to the church so beautifully. It's the commitment to adoration. So my community, we commit to 2 hours of adoration a day, 1 hour personally and 1 hour communally. If I didn't have adoration, I'd be on the floor there, a mess, you know what I'm saying? Like, adoration is like my lifeblood. So we need that. We absolutely need that in the church. Then we have to make choices to stop engaging in behaviours that are not in line with the values of Jesus. For us who are basically trying to do the right thing, I'm not talking about stopping, bashing your children or whatever. I'm talking about things like gossip, It's incredible how many Catholic parishes have just got a culture of gossip, Love it. People love a piece of meat, something to chew on, Get in there and just take a good bite. Bit of blood. They love a bit of dripping blood out of the thing, whether it's Father or it's that person in the sacristy or that person who did that, and how dare they, and who do they think they are? It's a choice to not engage in those behaviours and to be the person who doesn't wait for, St. Teresa of Avila to help me to do this, but to say, guess what, today I'm not going to gossip. I'm going to make a decision not to gossip today. If someone tries to make me do that, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I need to go to the toilet, or whatever it is, Get yourself out of the situation, And I say this as someone who also has a tendency to gossip, so I'm talking about myself here, And then there's decisions around getting out of situations. So the classic thing for me here, I worked as a chaplain to the maximum security prison here in Melbourne for 2 years. It's a men's prison. My consistent experience is that you'd have these big, scary, like I'm a pretty weedy fella. There's nothing to do in prison except, weights. So you get these guys coming to Mass and they're like, "G'day, Father, how are you?" And you're like, their bicep is the size of your head, and you're kind of like, okay, you're just like, yeah, I'm great, thanks very much, So having this nervous breakdown while you're preaching the homily to it, and Jesus says, change your life, talking to these murderers and drug things. Oh, yeah, you're right, Father. Yeah, it's good to do that. And but generally, if the guys that come into Mass, they're basically good-hearted guys. And what's happened, almost every single situation is that they have got caught up in the wrong crowd. So they've got caught up in drugs. That's 95% of them have got caught up in drugs, and then they've ended up in these situations that lead them to get into jail. And then I remember having a conversation with this one guy who was like, national tattoo champion. It was like, oh, wow, there's so many tattoos on you. That's incredible. Like, it was full on. And he was just terrified to get out of prison because he knew his mates had already started coming to prison saying, oh, we're looking forward to you getting out. We're going to go straight back into that. He was terrified because he was going to go straight back into this circle of friends who just wanted to get him back on the drugs. They couldn't wait for it. And so the work there, I didn't do this as a chaplain, they had a support network, was to get those guys connected to men's support groups and churches and that kind of thing, where they had alternative environments so they wouldn't be led back into those situations, This is not rocket science, and it's not even about praying endlessly, it's just good human stuff. Get them into a good environment and they'll be fine, Connect them to good guys. And we all know this in our own lives, and we know it in our families, we know it in our children, that this is the truth. So this is stage 3. This isn't as easy as it looked stage, otherwise entitled, Help God, I'm Sinking. I found this picture and I felt so sorry for this poor girl. It's so sad. I remember reading a beautiful book a couple of years ago, and I have to finish soon, so I'm sorry. I'm nearly finished. Have I nearly finished? Anyway, we're going to keep charging on. I remember reading a beautiful book a couple of years ago called The Power of Boundless Compassion by this man, Father Greg Boyle. So Greg is a Jesuit priest, and he works in a mission in Los Angeles with the Hispanic community in a gangland area in Los Angeles. So this is, we're talking drug deals and church car parks, murders are a normal kind of, part of the week, I guess, people get murdered. So he was really determined to reach out to the gang members, and most of them were these young Spanish background guys. And they're just, like, he said some of the stories in this book, and it's just I've heard a lot of confessions. I worked in a prison for 2 years. It was just gutting, like stories of little children being tied up in wire by their parents and have their cigarettes burnt on them and heads flushed down toilets on a regular basis if they didn't put the things away properly. So these men are just screwed, basically, just ruined by their family environments. Incredible violence, just unbelievable violence. And so he did incredible work with these guys, but eventually he had a nervous breakdown. And he had to have like 2 years in recovery because while he was doing incredible work, it was all his work. He wasn't being sustained by the spiritual energy that comes from the light of Jesus. And so he had a really hard lesson to learn, and he learned it. He shares about it. He returned to his work, and then he developed this thing called Homeboy Industries, which just provides a way out for these guys by getting them into jobs. You know, for men, you just need a job. You know, guys need to work. They need a place to work. They need to be connected to good guys and have something to keep them busy. And so he gets them into these training centres, and he gets them out of these violent, drug-fueled cycles that they're in. Now, this is a pretty dramatic example, but it illustrates something that's true for all of us, that we have to learn on this journey that it's not so much about what we do, but it's what God does in us. And that's a nice cliche, but until we actually experience this kind of breakdown, it doesn't really mean anything, you know. There's almost a sense in which we kind of almost have to break down. I don't know how else to say it. It's not like it's inevitable, but at some point we have to hit our humanity. We have to hit that hard so that we can really experience our need for God. Often the decision of the previous stage 2, you know, when we make a decision to commit, it carries with it all the awareness that we're sinners, okay? So we've got addictions, we've got weaknesses, we've got behaviours, we've got ways of being that need to be fixed. And what often happens with people, naturally, is that we try to fix those things. We jump into the pool and we try and swim our way through and fix it. Now, of course, we need to make those efforts, but without this realization that it's all about God's work and not us, we'll eventually break down, you know, because I've noticed what happens in this kind of stage is that people do a whole lot of things in their own strength. They might be going to Mass regularly, going to confession, praying the rosary and all the rest of that. And they're all good things, but it's all about what the person does to save themselves, you know. It's not really about what God is doing to save them. There's kind of this thing where people get this framework in place to secure them, and sometimes God gets locked out of that framework, even if it looks very religious. You know, it can look very spiritual, but God may not actually have a look in that environment. Now, that tendency to fix things is obviously coming out of a whole lot of stuff. Sometimes it's really hard to trust God. Sometimes it's easier to trust ourselves, you know. I find it hard to trust God. Perhaps we're afraid of falling back into old ways. Perhaps we're afraid of old addictions, whatever it might be. But whatever we kind of experience here, we have to move into a place where we recognize that none of this, getting our lives in order, is not the reason that God came. God came because he unconditionally loves us, you know. I just think that's a beautiful picture. That's the way the Father is with us. He's not asking the baby to get the moral life in order, you know what I'm saying? The moral life will get in order when the baby experiences the love of Jesus, you know. The baby will want to change. And that was my experience totally. When I knew Jesus loved me, I'm like, I've got to change my life. I've got to change my life, you know. Like, it was a natural experience because you know you're unconditionally loved and you don't want to keep living a crappy way of living. So it's this experience where we come back and we reconnect with the fact that in our brokenness, the only thing that the Father wants to do is reveal that he unconditionally loves us as his children, and that he is tender in that love for us, and that he wants to free us from the slavery to the conditions of worth that we have in our lives where we feel we have to justify our existence or prove our value before him. And in order to free us from this slavery to our own efforts or our own conditions of work, he will often do something which is very painful. He will break us. He is quite prepared to break us, in my experience, if he needs to bring this about. He will invariably bring us face to face with our weakness in such a way that we are forced to look at it, where we can't avoid it anymore. And he doesn't do this because he's a masochist. He does it because he wants to get us back on the path of genuine interior transformation. And we can only go on that path if we know that we're relying upon his strength and his grace and his mercy. And this is uncomfortable, and it's messy, and I hate it, and I wish it didn't happen, and da-da-da-da-da. But in some ways, we need it to happen. So when someone comes to me and says, "Oh, Father, my child is," I think, don't worry about it. Take a chill pill, go to bed, sleep. It's going to be okay. Sometimes God allows really strange situations to happen in order to reconnect us with our basic need for him. So let's just ride out the storm and trust the Father, So this, if this is supported, this stage, by people of faith and love, and if we invest more deeply in our prayer lives, then it leads us into the most important stage in our journey. And this is the journey for the rest of our lives. I wasn't sure if I should, swear in front of the Legion of Mary, but I want to say that this is the stage of facing our crap and being put back together. That's what this stage is about. So as I said before, as human beings, we are excellent at blocking out the areas of our lives that are basically crappy and that are not particularly attractive. But they will not go away. We can suppress them, repress them, push them. They will not go away. And any parts of us that are disconnected, unfaced, or not integrated will eventually make themselves felt as wounds. We will experience them as wounds. And you can pretend that you don't have a bleeding wound on your arm, but eventually it's going to bloody well hurt, It's going to bleed, and you're going to feel it, and you're going to be slipping in blood all over the place. Sometimes these things get so painful, we have to face them. And in fact, a lot of the damage that we do to ourselves is because we don't face them. I think there's a beautiful analogy here of, a devalued child in a family who has workaholic parents. I do some counselling work. Often the only way a child can get the parents' attention is to get onto drugs, or to start playing up at school, or to start, misbehaving. But as soon as the parent starts giving them attention, the child will start to settle because the needs are being met. The needs are being met. And I think for many of us, we spend all this time managing these parts of ourselves that we haven't faced and that we haven't had the vulnerability to bring out. But they're crying out for our attention. They're screaming sometimes for our attention. And it's often those parts that we fail, those children, if you want to put it that way, those parts within us that we do not bring into the light that undermine the light. I'm so convicted of this, that all the energy that we're using to manage our crap, if we undergo this process, will become energy for loving. It'll become energy for loving. You will become the light of the world. Jesus wasn't saying become the light of the world and then, go and do what you want. He was saying be transformed. Be the light of the world. Be transformed interiorly. And I'm really convicted that this is what God is calling us to when he calls us to freedom. It's the freedom to genuinely love because we are no longer enslaved to these broken parts, because we are no longer concealing them, because we're no longer trying to manage them, because we no longer think that we're not worthy of love or connection because of them. When we begin this journey, which I guess we all are on, and as we move through it, we discover that it's actually in those parts that the Father loves us most. I think it's beautiful. I guess I'm at the age where I have a lot of friends who have little children, and they love their children in the weakest parts. That's where their love is tenderest. It's where their children are weakest. And that's the way the Father relates to us, He loves us where we're weakest. And when we know that, that's when we can say that we know the heart of the Father for us. So let's allow ourselves to be transformed. Let's allow ourselves to engage this journey. Wherever we're at the moment, whatever we're working through, wherever we're on, let's allow ourselves to be engaged with this so that we can become his light for others. So yes, God turns all those broken pieces and he makes them into masterpieces. So thanks everyone for listening. I'm just going to do a promo. I'm sorry, Lewis, I didn't ask you to do this, but we have about 20 seminarians here and we've got about 20 other guys. We try to live a pretty simple life and basically we have enormous expenses related to our fees for our seminarians. I gave a talk at a thing once when I was a seminarian and someone came up and offered to sponsor me afterwards. If you're interested in supporting us in training our seminarians, and if you're not, that's also perfectly fine, but you might feel it on your heart that you'd like to support in some way our seminarians. I'm just going to leave these up here and you can grab one and get in contact with us. I hate doing promos, but I thought I've got to do this, so I'll leave them up over here. Thanks very much.